When you're on the battlefield, you're probably not thinking about all the fun that you're having. You're probably not thinking about how many human beings you can kill. You're not even thinking about your friends or your superiors. You're simply thinking about the enemy, where they are and where they will be. You're thinking about what you must do to avoid being killed. Now, I'm not a veteran, but I have read War and Peace, which means that I'm more than qualified to talk on the subject. It doesn't take a veteran to know that war is among the worst things that a person can face. As the great Leo Tolstoy once said, that shit's scary as fuck. Video games about war have, naturally, become so detached from the reality of their subject. The most popular games in the genre have turned into demented beasts that aren't even brave enough to spit propaganda in our faces anymore, choosing instead to force-feed the player cosmetics. Accuracy and realism don't even cross the mind of the developers. They've been replaced by thoughts about the bottom line. Multiplayer games like the latest Call of Duty and Battlefield are the most horrendous offenders, but even their campaigns aren't free from sin. How can we make an argument for an accurate portrayal of war when we are blessed with slow-motion segments and set pieces that instill a sense of awe, not fear? Games about war have suffered the same arc as movies about war. During World War II, movies focused on the heroes, war as spectacle. Then in the 1960s, the focus shifted to soldiers as individuals. Individuals with personal struggles. Individuals who feel the effects of war internally. Once CGI improved, we returned to spectacle. This loop, this fluctuating from sensationalism to realism, can be seen in games too. But it seems that the human-focused games are far fewer in number than the fun-focused ones. For every This War of Mine, there are 5 Call of Duties and a Medal of Honor game. Video essayists love to bring up Spec Ops: The Line. They point to it as this golden standard for games about the horrors of war. But I always felt that where it succeeds in substance, it fails in form. But that's a topic for another video, because it's not my objective to pick a fight with fans of Spec Ops, or grapple with my own love of Metal Gear Solid. Rather, I want to turn your attention to the many attempts to introduce horror into war games. Unfortunately, portraying the horrors of war is a difficult task for developers. But tacking on a horror-themed mode or introducing supernatural elements are among the easiest things that they could do. The just add zombies approach that Call of Duty took is less than satisfactory. I'll admit, the earlier maps like Kino de Toten and Verrückt oozed with atmosphere that scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. But the fear factor quickly wears off, and all you are left with is hundreds of hours of fun and good times, which for the purpose of this video, I must consider a failure. In their defense, the developers of Call of Duty likely never aimed to make the zombie mode scary. Brainless Nazis shuffling toward the player was simply a fun idea. Regardless, it was still an attempt to add horror to a game about war. A much better attempt was made by Frictional Games in 2023. Their long-awaited Amnesia the Bunker delivered an experience set during World War I that was undeniably scary, at least on a first playthrough. Can we leave it at that? Can I consider myself satisfied? Of course not, because it holds horror and war in 2 different hands, which is not what I want to see. With its claustrophobic halls, limited resources, and even more limited light, the setting itself was pulled straight from a nightmare. In a perfect world, the player would be stalking those halls, sticking to the shadows and avoiding enemy soldiers, killing only when necessary. Sadly, that's not what we got. The developers must have decided that war was not scary enough on its own, so they decided to elevate it. Amnesia was already an established horror series which was filled with monsters and supernatural elements, so it's wrong for me to expect anything less than that in the bunker. Still, I can't help but see the wasted potential. What we got in the place of enemy soldiers was instead a game where a French soldier is trapped in the dark with an almost unkillable monster. Its sunken eyes, claws and fangs are enough to send shivers down your spine, especially when it disappears then reappears through a hole in the wall. While it's effective as a survival horror game, this supernatural presence is not a product of war. It's a product of the horror genre itself. War, in this case, is little more than a disturbing backdrop for supernatural horror. As a result, Amnesia the Bunker succeeds as a horror game, but fails to truly confront the horrors of war. The only thing scary about the war is how many damn shots the protagonist can take in the trenches without dying. Buried beneath a pile of disappointing titles, we were blessed with another game about a French soldier navigating dark hallways and managing their resources. A game that is just as harrowing as it is grueling. It's equal parts fun and immersive. It is one of the 5 good things to come out of Screen Australia since 2009. In my eyes, Conscript succeeds where other wargames fail. It captures something that they don't. It forces you to consider the realities of war, even if just for a few brief moments. Instead of filling players with the thrill of the fight or making them fear some supernatural beast, it puts them in the shoes of a regular soldier during the war. Other games have attempted to do this. The opening mission of Battlefield 1 comes to mind. But triggering a slow motion last stand and putting the character's name and age on the screen just didn't do it for me. Any subtlety is thrown out the window with the speech at the end of the level. Conscript is different. Its commentary is more subtle. It doesn't tell you how to feel. The game succeeds on atmosphere alone. I've seen people say that a horror game cannot be scary without monsters, but I find this argument absurd. In real life, we feel fear, but the cause of our fear is usually human. There are no monsters in real life, but if someone walked closely behind you on the street late at night, I'm sure you'd feel something akin to fear. Conscript gives you that feeling of another person's breath on the back of your neck. You lurk through trenches, bunkers, farmhouses in a burning town. Sometimes you're keeping an eye out for enemies hiding in the shadows. Other times, you're avoiding them as they march back and forth, looking for you. With these human enemies, you play games of cat and mouse, doing your best to get the upper hand, avoiding direct combat as much as possible. But the game never strays too far from its setting. There are full-scale battles that take place. A general will hold a gun to the back of your head and force you to charge the enemy. Fear is replaced with adrenaline, and as your comrades are slowly killed, the fear comes back. All this without a monster or a ghost. Just fellow human beings who are trying to survive. I knew that I was playing a very special game when, instead of charging the enemy, I chose to hide. Stepping out, you were left empty. You left your friends to die. Could you have helped? Would you have met the same fate? Will you fight next time? The player, on their first playthrough at least, is forced to consider whether they would act any differently in real life. Can I say for certain that I am brave enough to face death head on? How many of us, in the era of Netflix, Menulog and Amazon Prime, would die for our country? At the beginning of the last century, millions of young men didn't have a choice. That is what this game is getting at. This feeling, these questions, they are proof that Conscript succeeds. Not once have I ever taken the time to consider this while playing Call of Duty. Conscript takes it even further. It wants us not only to consider ourselves, but everyone else. It wants us to try and understand war. When you engage in a gunfight, the thrill lasts a few seconds. You roll out of the way of your enemy's melee weapon, run to get a bit of space between you, and then fire. Simple enough. But sometimes, they won't die. They lie helpless, moaning, bleeding to death. You can spend the ammo or weapon durability to put them out of their misery, or you can leave them to be eaten alive by the rats. Other times, you'll come across shell-shocked soldiers who twist and turn on the spot with their hands on their ears. These collections of pixels know more about war than most of us. They stand in the place of the 250,000 men who met the same fate in World War I. The mass graves and piles of bloodied corpses give us just a glimpse at the millions of people who met their end. You struggle through labyrinths comprised of winding hallways and dark rooms. You stare down trenches that are long, intricate, and often besieged by enemies. Enemies dropped pictures of their loved ones. After killing them, you'll find the same picture again on another corpse, this time covered in blood. Your character doesn't march into battle confidently. Their hands tremble as they take aim. You are not a killing machine. You are another young man sent off to war. The story and atmosphere direct our focus from war games to war itself. The game mechanics elevate it to something horrifying, not just in substance, but in form. Conscript could have very easily been another Call of Duty. A lone soldier running and gunning through trenches, picking up enemy weapons when they run low on ammunition, and spamming grenades when things look grim. There wouldn't be anything to fear. Enemy soldiers would become target practice. Although the game mechanics limit your effectiveness in combat, hundreds of enemies will die at your hand by the end of the game, at least on regular difficulty. Still, it is the form that elevates this setting from another wargame to true survival horror. The first thing you'll notice is the isometric perspective. Instead of seeing through the eyes of your character, you hover above. But you aren't some all-seeing eye. Your sight is limited by the corners of the screen. Enemies can lurk just outside of your vision, charging into frame when they feel like it. Some soldiers will even hug the walls of a room, effectively remaining invisible as you walk past, which is when they'll strike. The dark limits your vision even more. Your only savior is a military flashlight that runs on batteries. It's directional, so you can only see what's in front of you. What's worse is the gas mask, which forms an outline on the screen that limits your vision even further. There are no nameplates above your enemies. The isometric perspective is not an advantage, but a decision that adds to the horror. Coupled with the visuals, Conscript has most of the survival horror elements that we know and love, although they are implemented in unique ways. The game feels like an awkward blend between Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 1. There's an incredibly limited inventory. Instead of an attachment case, we get a number of slots that can be increased over time. 8 slots to begin with is more than you got as Chris in Resident Evil 1, but there are so many items that are hard to live without. At all times, I would carry at least a gun, some ammo, a flashlight, and a melee weapon, which leaves you with just 4 slots for key items and extra supplies. The limited inventory makes backtracking necessary. You'll have to haul ass from one side of the trench to a safe room, then lug the next key item to the other side of the trench. This might not seem intimidating, especially once you've killed all the enemies, but this game took yet another page from Resident Evil's book. Corpses draw the attention of rats over time. Your first time running past one, you might just hear a squeak. Next time, you'll see some small rats picking at it, but they'll run away when you approach. Until finally, the rats grow to monstrous size, chasing you down, dealing damage and potentially infecting you, leaving you with half of your standard health until you cure the ailment. You have a few methods of dealing with this. You can use a fuel and a lighter to destroy the bodies. You can use a grenade to destroy the holes that house the rats. Or you can blow them to smithereens, a temporary solution. If rats weren't bad enough, while you're backtracking, there's a chance that you'll hear that dreadful whistle, and the trench will be charged by another horde of enemy soldiers. Limited inventory slots necessitate backtracking. Backtracking forces you to deal with enemies. Dead enemies attract rats. All of this takes place while you balance your resources and try to solve the next puzzle. It's near perfect for survival horror. Beyond the similarities to Resident Evil 1, there's the mechanics borrowed from Resident Evil 4. Safe rooms are of course a staple of survival horror. Scattered across the map, we can find rooms lit by calming blue light, in which we can meet the merchant, who can buy our valuables, sell us resources, and upgrade our weapons. Across the entire playthrough, this man will be one of the only faces that will provide you with a genuine sense of relief. It's difficult to talk about the combat in relation to other games, because the isometric perspective really changes how you approach each encounter, but in terms of pace, I can only think of Resident Evil 4, perhaps even the remake. You sprint around, out of the range of your enemies. You perform a combat roll to evade attacks. You can strike them with a melee attack to briefly stun them before switching to a gun to finish them off. The combat, while intense, is fluid and fun. You quickly fall into this loop of running away, taking aim and shooting, but this only helps reinforce your fear of getting hit. There's a special kind of dread that you feel as you're being chased down by a brute, knowing damn well that you can't do anything until you stand still and reload. It's fundamentally different to other survival horror games, but it gets you just a bit closer to the feeling of being a soldier in combat. I know that's like saying that this game really makes you feel like Batman, but fuck it. Behind all these mechanics is a war game that is elevated to a horror game, not by a scary monster or zombies with glowing eyes, but by atmosphere and mechanics. The form transforms the subject. The developer understands. War is terrifying. There are few things worse. The industry makes a complete joke of it. Conscript doesn't. Are games like Call of Duty and Battlefield immoral? Of course not. I'm not a masochist. Games can be fun. Not everything needs to strive for realism. I don't need to see a mass grave or a guy with shell shock to see that I'm in a war game. It's just a breath of fresh air to play something as brave and confident in its vision as Conscript. We can justify entertaining games about war the same way that we can justify entertaining movies about war. A dark subject doesn't always need dark treatment. We don't always need the Human Condition trilogy or Come and See. Sometimes it's good enough to watch Platoon or closely watch Trains. My point is simply that Conscript falls into the former category. It strives for realism to get its message across, and it uses survival horror as its catalyst. For me, it succeeds in portraying the horrors of war in ways that military simulators could never dream of. Horrors of war is a phrase that's lost all meaning to me as I've tried to write this video. To me, there's nothing but horror in war. Horror is war's nature. War is the most horrible thing in life. Sometimes we just need media that shows war for what it is. Conscript does it right.